now, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, the Global Stocktake, the first of its kind, was published in October of this year. It is a comprehensive assessment of progress, or should I say lack thereof, since the Paris Agreement in 2015, and has created headlines around the world. These have been headlines ranging from fear to outrage and pessimism. With us to evaluate the future, built on the collective effort, are our fabulous panelists. Please can we welcome to the stage Paul Dickinson, founder of CDP, Fiona Maitland, senior advisor to Groundswell, Emma Cox, PwC's head of purpose and leader of the sustainability and climate change team, Shia Bastida, founder of the Re-Earth Initiative and ambassador to the UN High-Level Champions, and of course, Mitzi Tan, international spokesperson for the Youth Advocates of Climate Action from the Philippines and the Fridays of the Future of the Philippines. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for being here today. The stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, especially to Extreme Hangout for this extraordinary opportunity. To everybody here in the room. It's not a room exactly, but everybody here and everybody online. And I'm just going to say a brief introduction of myself, and then we'll go down and everyone will say a little bit about themselves. My name is Paul Dickinson. I am the founder of a big NGO called CDP. The Harvard Business Review called it the most powerful NGO you've never heard of. So that's my life. But there you go. I'm not really here to talk about that. I also have the privilege with the great leader Christiana Figueres and her friend Tom Rivett-Carnac to be co-presenter of the Outrage and Optimism podcast. Do listen, we've had fantastic guests. Thank you. Round of applause. Shia Bastida has been a guest on Outrage and Optimism. Fiona Maitland has been a co-host on Outrage and Optimism. I hope that we'll get chances to get others on. Enough about me. We'll come on to the topic in a moment. But why don't we go down the line? Fee, why don't you say a little bit about yourself?
Thank you so much, Paul. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here, especially with such an amazing co-panelist. I'm Fee. I was previously running a campaign called Race to Zero as part of the Climate Champions team, which was all about mobilizing non-state actors to commit to net zero. And earlier this year shifted to a slightly different project that we're referring to as Groundswell. And this is a project that is a joint project, a joint initiative with Global Optimism, the Bezos Earth Fund, and Systems Change Lab. And really this project is born out of the fact that we are failing. The climate narrative is failing us. And Amber, you mentioned the fact that the media headlines are fear, are anger, and that seems to be spiraling us into a doom loop of despair, when actually it feels like we're facing two parallel opposite truths. We're kind of in the middle of a Dickens novel. It's the best of times and it's the worst of times. And I think we really need to recognize this. We are facing exponential impacts. It's getting hotter every day. Reports have come out highlighting endlessly the records that we're breaking. And at the same time, we're seeing fantastic progress emerging across systems of our global economy, which I'm sure we'll come on to later. But the point is that I think we really need to elevate this second truth to give us a collective sense of possibility, of agency, which can together unite us in using this year of the Global Stocktake as a moment where we recognize why we're way off track and what we need to do. But instead of feeling so desperate about that, we turn that into a moment where we set ourselves onto a path to course correct the delivery of the Paris Agreement into 2024 and 2025. So really looking forward to this conversation about the Global Stocktake, and thanks for having me.
Go, Emma.
Great. And can I echo, it's wonderful to be here in this amazing setting. I was privileged enough to come to Extreme Hangout in Sharm last year, which was a wonderful Bedouin tent. And I think you've equaled it here with a wonderful setting. And my name's Emma Cox. I'm Global Climate Leader at PwC. PwC is a big professional services firm. So what does that mean? It means that we work with businesses, with governments, with cities, with people to drive change in every aspect of life. So we touch lots and lots and lots of things. And that's both a massive opportunity and a big responsibility, which we take really seriously. The average age of people across our 325,000 people is about 27. So given that there are old people like me, Actually, the average age is pretty young. And we're passionate about the fact that everybody needs to have a voice on this important agenda of climate change, and have pivoted our organization to make action on climate change one of our 3 strategic global priorities. The others being actually building trust in that transition and the transformation that it needs. So they all need to work together. And I think that, for me, is one of the themes coming out of the global stocktake is we may not be where we need to be, but we also need to do it differently going forward. So it's about an action agenda that gets everybody involved, not in separate silos with separate agendas, but making the connections that we need to bring it all together, which is why I'm so excited to be on this panel to start to bring some of that to life, because we haven't got time to waste. We need to take action now.
Thank you. Thank you, Shia.
Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you for coming. And thank you, Extreme Hangout, for having us. My name is Shia Bastida, and I'm a 21-year-old climate justice activist from Mexico. And I always start by saying that my activism started before I was born, because my parents actually met at a climate conference in 1992 in the first Earth Summit. And then they kept seeing each other at different conferences, kind of like we do. And then my mom told my dad, I'm going to marry you in 5 years. And that was it. The rest is history. So I grew up with my parents telling me about the UN, about climate change, and in my life, they were the only people talking about it. And I thought, my parents are crazy. Why are they the only people that I know talking about what seems to be the biggest existential crisis to ever have inhabited the world? And in 2015, my hometown flooded. And I said, everything that my parents have been telling me is actually materializing in front of me at my doorstep. And so I realized that I couldn't pursue veterinary school. I had to be a climate activist because I knew more than most people did. And I think now it is our goal as the climate movement, as the youth climate movement and beyond, to really ground people on what it feels like to be alive today, a young person today, and think of a future that is uncertain. And so I really see it as a responsibility, if we know, to act, and then to get the message to those who don't know. So I think the global stocktake at a core is about that, telling a full story of where we are so that we can have a better story of where we end up.
Thank you so much. Let's see.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matijo Naltan. I'm a full-time climate justice activist from the Philippines. And similar a little bit to Shea, where growing up, I saw the impacts of the climate crisis, but I didn't know what it was because no one taught us what climate change was. They tell us about the emissions, the melting ice caps and polar bears, but not about what we were experiencing as a country, as communities. Being consumed by floods was the climate crisis, and that there's something that we can actually do about it. And so, as she was saying, that importance of information and education and knowing, it's such a crucial thing. And that's such a big responsibility for us to be able to communicate what's happening here in Dubai in the UN Climate Summit, because to the outer world, because so often it gets reduced to just our spaces. And the point that we need to do is to make sure that everyone is talking about this. Everyone understands what this is. And starting with the global stocktake, it is such a complicated word even, right? Like if you look at the word global stocktake, you're like, what is this? What is this about? What are they trying to say? What are they stock taking? You know, so it's really about communicating that to the entirety of the world so that we know that there is something that we can do about it. And we know where to put pressure on the world leaders and the key stakeholders to ensure that we're going towards that climate just world.
Thank you all very, very much. Well, we're very much looking forward to this discussion. We have everything we need here. I'm here in COP. I'm here with all of my friends, pretty much, that I know. I'm here with a whole bunch of people that I'm finding it really hard to be friends with, but it's my learning edge, and I'm going to get there, so we can work on that together. And I haven't got enough sleep, but that's also the same. This is very COP. I think that the thing about the global stocktake, perhaps many of you know, is that we're looking at a 3-degree temperature rise. If we say if that's the kind of information, and we have to kind of reduce emissions by 40% by 2030, which is possible with a war economy and rationing. Okay, that's my summary. Actually, Shia, you are, as you said, an expert who grew up in this. You've been with the subsidiary bodies developing this. Can you just tell us really what the Global Stocktake is? Because one thing, we had this great conversation earlier, and I was thinking like the Global Stocktake is information, and you said it's process, and we need to think about outcomes. So can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So I had no idea what the Global Stocktake was. Can you hear me?
It could be maybe a little louder, but
yeah. Oh, perfect. So I had no idea what the Global Stocktake was when people started talking about it, and I remember we were, a big group of us going to Bonn to the SBs. So if you don't know, the SBs happen every single summer in between the COPs, and there's actually an SB conference going on at COP.
And what does SB stand for?
SB stands for the subsidiary body meeting. So it's more negotiations on climate. And I had no idea that there were climate negotiations happening outside of COP. And so we thought it was really important for us to show up there as well as a youth constituency. So I went to Bonn for 2 weeks to the SBs, and that's when the roundtables for the Global Stocktake were happening. So basically, all of the countries coming together to talk about adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, and implementation. And, we were like, how do we get access to these spaces? Because the only people who can get access to it is people with party badges, like countries. So what they did was have 5 spots for non-state actors. And I had the privilege of being one of the people selected to speak on behalf of non-state actors at the Roundtable on Adaptation. So I said, now I really need to know what the Global Stocktake means because I'm going to be in that space. And in short summary, the Global Stocktake is painting a full picture of where we are with our Paris Agreement commitments along the tracks of adaptation, mitigation, implementation, and they're also including finance in this as well. And so I had a really incredible experience because Mitzi and I, we have been as youth activists on plenaries talking to world leaders, but we never ever get a response back. But in that roundtable, I did get a response back. I said, all youth of the world, we want a just transition away from fossil fuels. We want an equitable fossil fuel phase out. We want the loss and damage fund to be operationalized, which it was, but there's nearly not enough money there. And the main message was youth of the world want an end of the era of fossil fuels, and we want our Paris Agreement commitments to be fulfilled. And Saudi Arabia responded to me and said, as a young negotiator, I do not agree with you, so you cannot claim to speak on behalf of youth of the world. And then we had another response later, very diplomatically saying, if you are representing a country as a young person, you cannot speak for all youth either. So that was just a little window on what actually negotiations are, which is a very long, dragged-out process and bureaucratic process of parties and non-parties. And when we come in as youth representing a generation, not a country, it changes the dynamics completely. And so just to summarize and answer your question more directly, the Global Stocktake process has included some non-state actors and some civil society, because what we're trying to do is really make sure that there's no things missing out from the text of the Global Stocktake. So for example, collective but differentiated responsibility, which is basically saying the global north needs to step up first because they have historically emitted the most, is something that is still being debated on whether it's going to be included and if historical emissions are going to be included in the responsibilities of countries. And you cannot come in as a global north country and say, my historical emissions will not be taken into consideration. So we need to be there as civil society, understanding these processes and say, come on, like we have to include human rights in this. We have to include women, youth, indigenous peoples. We have to include, there's even maybe provisions of including debt cancellation into the Global Stocktake for countries that just historically haven't been able to develop their economies and cannot pay for things like losses and damages. So we'll get more into it, but that's like kind of a brief summary of what the Global Stocktake process has been like. And it's complicated, and a lot of people have been working really hard on it, and a lot of drafts will be coming out in the next few days. And I think if you can say what you said of the 7 years versus 7 days.
I'm going to try and bring Fiona in at the end, a sort of rousing thing, and we're all going to,
Okay.
But thank you for the suggestion. Thank you. Appreciate that explanation, which is very clear. So the Global Stocktake, I realize now, is something that we can use. It's maybe like a system. It's a process. It's a way of thinking about things. Mm-hmm. If I can come to you for, I know PwC does do some work with governments, but you're best known for working with corporations, I guess, big, huge global corporations, investors. They are also called non-state actors. but many of them are larger than countries. If you judge countries by government income, only 30 of the 100 largest economies in the world are nations. 70% of them are corporations. So these huge global actors, you were talking a little bit about people being at the heart of this and uniting. How do you see that in this process?
So thanks for a great Is this working?
Yeah.
Yes? Good. Excellent. So you were talking about the process of the negotiations, and business is not really at that table, if you like. So that's one of the strange features of the way that the process works. And it's one of the things that this COP is seeking to change and give much more voice to dialogue between business and government. Because what we're talking about here with these enormous corporations is the power to make change that can really transcend national boundaries. Businesses really weren't involved in the whole process of the climate negotiations at any scale until Paris. At Paris, they woke up a lot more. And then by Glasgow, they actually turned up. And at Glasgow, so that's a couple of years ago, businesses came and made commitments and have had a lot of challenge off the back of that about, are those commitments real and are they actually making progress on those commitments? With the Global Stocktake this year, I think it's an opportunity for business to take stock of where they are on the commitments that they've made and what are the plans that they can make to go forward, both on mitigation, but also on adaptation, on nature, on that equitable, just transition. Businesses employ people. People are citizens. They live in communities. They experience life around them, run by local governments and by governments. So they have voice and they have agency in many levels as an individual. So you don't just have one role to play. But business generates enormous amounts of money to make economies thrive. Climate change cannot be solved by governments alone. They need the help of the private sector to invest in ways that actually drive change and to provide the employment and the skills for the future. So from my perspective, business has a wonderfully positive role that it can play in uniting, using its big geographical base, its supply chains that reach out from big businesses down to small and medium-sized enterprises, down to individuals, and by really understanding what their footprints are and the impacts that they have and the positive wealth and operating environment that they can generate that generates those jobs for the future, they can use those choices to really drive change well and can influence governments and talk to governments. Because one of the really strange things in this climate change space is that actually businesses are asking for certainty about the operating environment and the regulations in which they operate. And so actually by having a consistency of approach and by talking across national boundaries about what it means and what it will take them to invest, what are the rules that they can operate by, we can really start to change the dialogue and really show more progress.
Thank you for
Systems
that.
change, it's all about.
Systems change, not climate change. I do have to put one caveat in there, is that there were some businesses that were rather negatively involved in the negotiations. No, not yourselves, but going back, over the last 20 or 30 years, there's some quite tricky stuff. But I would agree with your analysis that at Paris, the main part of business came in, and brands do have to have our trust to survive. But thinking back to the Global Stocktake and governments, Mitzi, you made an extraordinary comment about that essentially the Global Stocktake is revealing where nations are, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So the Global Stocktake, it's essentially an inventory, right, of like where we are at with the Paris Agreement, as Xie was mentioning earlier. So it will show quite clearly what action has been lacking, especially from countries like the US and the global north that have historically been responsible for the climate crisis. So really, this is an opportunity for us here, especially in these next few days, to really show where they're lacking and really ensure that this is something that is used to drive up pledges. And also, just a note on the businesses, it's really important to say that it is true that businesses have such a crucial role to drive change, especially because right now, majority of them are the ones driving the climate crisis, right? Like we have heard many statistics of how only 100 companies contribute to more than 70% of carbon dioxide emissions. So it really is the common but differentiated responsibility aspect that multinational companies, especially fossil fuel industries, have to really drastically also include that drastic cut down of emissions. And then with the global stocktake, that has to be accounted for as well by the government, and ensuring that governments are supposedly the ones who are creating policies to limit these emissions across their country. And then the global stocktake will have a global outview and overlook on it, so that ideally countries can also collaborate, seeing that this is where I'm lacking, this is where you're lacking, we need to get here, how do we get there? And ensuring that, as Chie was mentioning earlier, the Global South is not left behind, both in the emissions cut down, in finance, in adaptation, and in loss and damages.
Okay, I think we're going to come back to all of these themes. I'd love to talk more about NDCs and about policy, but Fee, you said something about these next 7 days at Decisive. Can you talk about that?
Well, I think what we've been all sharing is just how important this global stocktake opportunity is. And yet it doesn't necessarily feel, Shia, as you were saying, like many people understand it because it's so technical. What I think people do understand is that we are in a decisive decade, and we know that this is the decade where we need to see huge transformations to meet the 40% reduction pool that you were talking about. But let's zoom that back into where we are now. And I think we've got 7 days to make that decision decisive to really turn around where we're at. And so I think, first of all, it's really important to acknowledge the good progress that we have seen. I think the loss and damage fund, whilst there's still a lot to come, has been really fantastic to see. Renewable energy and the pledge on that has been also really energizing, no pun intended. And food as well, over 110 countries signing up to a food declaration, unprecedented. So I think all of that momentum needs to be absolutely captured, because now is the time where we risk tipping into the negatives and the discussions and the deliberations. And so where can we all collectively, yourselves included, and across business, across youth, across health professionals, across cities, across all these different stakeholders, come together and really unite behind specific outcomes that we think are still going to be undecided, and where we need to tip that balance in order to set ourselves on track for the next year and the next 5 years. And so I think what's needed is a bit of a sort of coming together moment, both to signal to ministers, to negotiators, to heads of delegation that the real economy is behind this and they want high ambition to come out of the negotiations. And as we've also been saying, this needs to be communicated to a broader public, and we need to show that momentum is happening. This is underway. I mean, we've seen in EVs, we've reduced battery costs by 16% per year. In renewables, we've doubled already the rate of solar and wind deployment every 3.5 years. I mean, that's huge, and it's happening so much faster than we expected. So how do we communicate that message to a broader public so that they understand that they need to get on this train because it's moving, whilst also making sure that we're continuing up that pressure and collaboration with the national government so that they really hear where our intentions lie?
Yeah, no, people say to me sometimes that, this is all kind of regulatory and it's a bit dull and a little bit of a controversial character, not necessarily my favorite human, but the richest person in the world does make electric cars. I mean, there is definitely a buck in climate change, if you know what I mean. I'd like to dig into the NDCs, but did anyone want to respond on any of the points that we've just made? No? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the NDCs, because the nationally determined contributions issued by nations every 5 years are available on the UNFCCC website. Have a look. I have. And they are not in a consistent format. They're not even searchable PDFs, some of them. The great nation of India, sorry to pick on them, but 1.4 billion people and 3 pages of A4. It doesn't kind of, there's some kind of imbalance here. So, is the global stocktake maybe part of a process that could lead to an upgrade in the structure? And there's a lot of nodding going on. Dania, please.
It is supposed to, so the draft of the preambles almost of the stocktake came out, I think, last night or the other day. And it is supposed to inform the NDCs, and it is supposed to ensure that the NDCs actually say something meaningful that we can actually track, because that's what the NDCs are. That's what the global stocktake is. It's all to ensure that we're on track to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And, we're lacking on even the tracking part. And so that's really showing us how much we need to push forward and ensuring that we have clearer outcomes on what the NDCs should look like, what should be included in them, and that's required to be included in them. For example, and a lot of people don't know this, military emissions of countries aren't required to be put into the NDCs. And the military emissions are some of the biggest sources of emissions in the world. Also remembering that with climate finance, we're seeing small drops in the bucket while we're seeing so much budget for militarization. And so that's definitely something that we need to be bringing into the conversation around the global stocktake and the NDCs.
Yeah. Something that struck me about the global stocktake preambles as well is, there's a part that says the global stocktake should be written with equity and the best available science. And the best available science, it's coming out with the IPCC reports all the time. And now there's a new framework called the planetary boundaries. And some of you might have heard that we have surpassed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries that exist. And so that is the type of fullness and holistic approach that we need to be taking in climate solutions, especially with the global stocktake. The IPCC report have been instrumental into everything that we have done as a climate community. But we also need to be taking into account the full of biodiversity, the full of the cryosphere, etc. So I think by having the best available science here, it's a huge window of opportunity into actually doing a more holistic approach towards even NDCs and what countries are committing to, because that's what that NDCs are, right? Commitments. And something that we have to be really careful about is that we stop giving countries the opportunity to follow loopholes and create loopholes for themselves. Because, for example, just in general, but in the global stocktake specifically, there's still a slash on whether we're going to write phase out of fossil fuels or phase down of fossil fuels. And phase down means, we'll have a little bit. And phase out means we're rebuilding the system so that we're not dependent on them. And so that's why even the smallest words take weeks to negotiate. And they're so, so important because they lay the pathway on whether countries and companies can engage in loopholes or not. And I think what we're saying is we really need to be honest with ourselves and have a type of language that allows us to have that transition. So we need a 43% reduction of emissions by 2030 from 2019 levels to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. And since 2019, we have decreased 2%. So we need so much more buildup of actual infrastructure to reduce emissions. Not only an equitable fossil fuel phase out, but an equitable renewable energy phase in, which is the other conversation on whether the global south is still going to bear the brunt of a new energy transition and revolution. So all of that to say, the NDCs, like the fact that they're not standardized, the fact that we cannot track progress, the fact that we're still debating on phase down versus phase out language is hurtful for our generation, because transparency is the number one thing that we need for tracking, and tracking is the number one thing that we need for progress. So the global stocktake should put that at the center and say we need to standardize across so that we can together as a world move forward in our commitments. So I think it's a huge opportunity, and I don't think we can afford to miss that.
I'll come to you, Emma. I've spent 20 years getting non-state actors to report consistently. Friends in the audience have been working on this kind of thing as well. Absolutely, let's bring the governments in, Emma.
And I think the great comments here. I think the thing I'd like to say from a business perspective is business also needs to make great strides in that consistency and comparability of reporting. Some years ago, Peter Backer, who leads something called the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, said, accountants will save the world. Well, I'm an accountant, and I don't think it's the sole responsibility of accountants to save the world, but there is a truism in that what gets measured gets managed.
Yeah.
And that transparency, that transparency of governments shouldn't just be of governments, it should also be of business, right? So if we actually want to get to a global baseline, it needs to include many actors within that. And that, within the business community, there's been an enormous amount of work going on to standardize and come up with approaches and rules around reporting on carbon and more broadly on sustainability, so that you can actually make those comparisons. Now, we're not there yet, but one of the things that I would say about this COP so far is that many people from across different parts of the system are getting together in parallel with what's going on the global stocktake to talk about what does it actually mean for business to report? how do we make sure that the new standards that have come out get adopted all around the world and form that new baseline that the ISSB is pushing for? So that's the international, sorry, I'm being attacked by a fly here, International Sustainability Standards Board. And I think from a business point of view, what's important about this reporting language, because reporting can seem very dry, as we were saying with the stock take, is it delivers you insights, because when you actually know where you're starting from, then you can make a plan for where you're going to, and you can be held to account for what progress you're making. But if you all measure things in different ways, then there isn't that comparability. You don't actually know who is good and who is bad. So you need good data, you need good systems, but to be honest, you just need to get on with it. So we want businesses to start by disclosing where they are and what their targets are, and then making proper transition plans for how to get that progress to that net zero future that we're aiming for. But there are good building blocks in progress, not only now on climate, but also on all the other levers, because you need to work with your supply chain. You need to think about nature. You need to think about circular economy. We can't just keep using more and more of the world's resources. We've got to use it in a better way. And business is thinking across all those agendas.
And I agree with your point about what gets measured gets managed. And that was a mantra in the organization I've been working in, where we're getting companies to report. But we had Bill Clinton spoke at one of our events in 2007, and he said, you've got to keep score. And that's your point, Shears. It's like, we're going to score nations, and people are going to understand. For example, global investors can invest in lots of different countries. Which ones should they choose to invest in? B.
Sorry,
you moved to speak.
I really gasped. No, I was just going to fully agree with everything that's been said, and I think this transparency is so important. And I think often we're caught in the trap of data management and looking at what's not going right. And I think really critically, there are absolutely negative tipping points, and they are really frightening, and we have to be aware of them. And there are positive tipping points. And I think getting behind those and understanding the opportunities and the carrots that we're facing, not just the sticks, and of course they have to come together, I think is really important. And Shia, you mentioned the 2% decrease, and of course that's so far off where we need to be. At the same time, I think that's kind of massively exciting. It's a decrease. This is the first time we've seen that. And so I think recognizing what that might mean, and we know that change often happens slowly at first and then much faster than we ever thought it was possible. And so I think really understanding the nature of change that we're facing can help us rally behind the opportunities that we want to really make the most of, as well as making sure that is being, that the laggards is sort of being moved through better regulation and infrastructure. But I do think that we've got to a stage where we're really seeing, and I'm interested in your views on this, but green hushing has really brought businesses to become a lot quieter, even if they're doing really positive stuff on climate. And so I think we need to rebalance a little bit the positive signals of change and share learnings, be humble about that, but make sure that we're not quashing what is actually happening just to be sort of fully transparent on everything that's going badly as well. So just wanted to note the balance.
Okay. Well,
I don't mind. So greenwashing and green hushing, we've heard a lot about greenwashing and people making commitments that they don't live up to, that don't have substance. Green hushing is a phenomenon that I think is quite dangerous, because it is where companies are doing stuff, but they don't want to talk about it or others are doing stuff. They don't want to talk about it for fear of actually activism against them or challenges against their record, and they'd rather say nothing. But actually, this is all, to make progress, we've got to share, and we've got to share transparently. And that's why you come back to the fact that data is really important. You're not agreeing with me here.
We haven't found our rhythm yet, I would say. But I think in about 10 or 15 minutes, we're going to get some questions perhaps. But before then, I would like to pivot to what I think is a really significant thing, which is, so to say, policy. And I'm going to inflict on you a little medical metaphor that this disclosure stuff, which I've been doing for a long time and with distinguished colleagues, is really like an X-ray. But no one's ever been cured by an X-ray. Very important, but it doesn't cure. And then for example, in the world of non-state actors, we have an initiative called the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or many investors have committed to net zero, and that's a bit like a diagnosis. And then there are things that the medical profession call lifestyle changes, like buy renewable energy and invest in energy efficiency, electric vehicles. But then you may well kind of hit the limit of what you can do yourself. And if you need actual medicines or surgery, the patient can't do that themselves. So I'm being a bit provocative here, but I'm really enjoying the nodding down the end. So let's go down there. Isn't there maybe a pivot now in the whole global climate movement where we say, friends, now we've got to have the policy, the regulation, the laws to reduce emissions, to coin a famous phrase, treat a crisis like a crisis? Yeah. Or Mitzi.
Yeah, I mean, I really love this question because I think it's good to remind ourselves that a lot of the activism that you're describing, and like, I'm going to define activism for myself because I think it's also something that we all have different perspectives on what it means. And some people actually feel negative about the word activism. For me, activism is the practice of identifying what is wrong and then being really creative to imagine a different world. So for me, activism is a practice of creativity, of being constantly creative and constantly challenging yourself to think better. And so with that in mind, I want to remind everybody that most of the activism around climate is legal right now. So if you think of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, on the advisory opinion for the International Court of Justice of how countries are doing and what the responsibilities of countries is to people for the environment. And then we have ecocide law. So are we going to make the destruction of nature illegal? And then we have, all of the youth suing their countries and governments and etc. So, and then me and some of my friends were launching an initiative called the Rights for Future Generations. So are we able to expand international law to actually have rights of future generations at the core of some of our decisions? Because what would the world look like if every business had to think of 7 generations in the future? If every government had to think of 7 generations in the future? And what would our world be like today if our ancestors had put into place legal frameworks to protect the future? And so what we're saying is there is some surgical things coming in terms of climate policy that are not going to allow businesses and countries to just do pledges without enforcement. Because we want to, for example, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, we want fossil fuels to stop being produced, not just because it's voluntary and countries want to, but because it's an absolute necessity. And if it's not being done already, it has to be done because somebody's enforcing it and there's consequences to that. And so, but we don't want to get to a point where, like, to Fiona's spirit of, we want to collaborate and do things and celebrate what we're doing, right? We don't want to get to a point where we're just punishing everybody because they're not doing things fast enough. But at the same time, the fossil fuel industry has been lying for decades and lobbying and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a balance on how do we push forward with things like the Paris Agreement, NDCs, the global stocktake, but also the international frameworks of legal ways in which we can hold things accountable and each other accountable, especially for youth. How are we going to create a framework where we stop begging people to do things for us? Governments, please reduce your emissions. Companies, please work together. Please stop greenwashing. When do we get to say, oh my God, when do we get to say we're taking our future into our hands and making sure that you have to sign on to our Declaration of Future Generations and making sure that you have to sign on to protect and be able to assure me what 2100 is going to look like? And for example, with the planetary boundaries that I was talking about earlier, there is going to be an annual planetary health check, and there is going to be proposed just transition pathways, and also a resiliency check to see how countries are doing. And we cannot get there if we don't all radically collaborate. And so, yeah, I think that's where a lot of the surgical things that you were talking about are going to come from, just from civil society having to be really imaginative because governments haven't done it.
See.
The thing is, the medicine that you've been talking about, so many scientists, even the International Energy Agency, the civil society, youth activists everywhere have been saying for years now, it's available to us. The world leaders are just not taking it. It is that equitable fossil fuel phase out. And Chie talked about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty a little bit, but what they're essentially proposing is that We've seen how the UNFCCC and the COP processes, they've not been effective on having that fossil fuel phase out clearly. It's been 28 years, no, 29 if you count the year that hasn't happened. And still, we don't have like clear phrasing on a fossil fuel phase out. There's always some kind of loophole. And so the Fossil Fuel Treaty is now proposing a new treaty outside of this process to ensure that the fossil fuel industry can stop lobbying within the spaces where we're in, right? Like 2 days before COP, leaked documents show that COP President Al-Jaber was using the bilateral meetings on the lead up to COP to lobby for fossil fuels. So there you clearly see the lack of transparency around the global stocktake, around the NDCs, around this whole process. So what we really need to ensure is that we are creative, as Chie was saying, to not just limit ourselves to one area and one space, and really ensure that we have these measures in space and make sure that we're really getting binding, concrete action, because that's what we need in this moment. We really, really need to collectively push for that fossil fuel phase out, for the climate finance. This is the medicine that we've been talking about for years, and it's available to us. It's just being kept away from the world.
Yeah.
So creative. I love the idea of creativity. I think that when you want to change something, you've got to change something. Fee, I've had the privilege to work with you for about 2 years now, thinking about policy. Do you want to say a little bit about how you see it showing up, or how our movement can change the cycle to sort of accelerate policy deployment?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually thinking, as you were saying, the importance of businesses collaborating, and what you were both saying about this need for better conversation. And I'm really struck this COP actually on a couple of occasions, seeing and witnessing businesses coming into conversations with heads of delegation and ministers, and really showing up to support and demonstrating waves of mobilization that are cross stakeholder and businesses with cities and health professionals together, showing their appetite for a fossil fuel free future. And that conversation just doesn't seem to have happened enough before. And I'm really surprised that that's not been something regular. And these ministers and heads of delegation are so grateful that they're having this opportunity to talk with businesses and understand what is actually out there. And so I think what we're now starting to shift is that the right-wing movement and the fossil fuel lobbyists have been incredibly powerful at policy, and we just need to learn some of those tricks to be a bit sharper about how we communicate with policymakers, so that it needs to become a more flexible, I think slightly faster paced and faster moving collaboration between businesses, between citizens, between other actors in society, and mayors and states as well, or subnational governments that really, I think, lead the charge on a lot of policy. But bringing all of that together in a conversation to more agilely shape what is wanted by civil society, because I think it does have the huge power to then create the infrastructure within which these actors can play.
Don't be backward in coming forward. We have a few minutes just for any questions. If anybody has a hand, wants to,
Thank you. It's James Morris from PwC. It's a question mainly for Zia and Mitzi, although other people might have a view, which is, you talked about the role of youth at the negotiations and others. Negotiations, although they're sort of based on legitimacy, but that's backed by power. Like, governments are able to make changes, and that's how they secure outcomes. And you talked about how you might be able to use lawfare and other mechanisms to get change if policy change happen. But first, you've got to get those changes to actually happen, to get the laws changed and so on. So how do you think about how you can actually, what is the mechanism for securing the kind of negotiated outcomes or legal changes when you are speaking as youth and you don't have the power of a big global corporation or of a country or a military, all of those other things? Like, how do you actually get change to happen?
So that's a really good question, because I think the underlying question there is, how do you institutionalize our generation into decision-making processes so that decisions are made with the future in mind as well, not just all of these other interests going around. And there's a lot of initiatives going on. For example, the Climate Reality Project is training hundreds of youth negotiators every year now. And Mexico, for example, has 4 youth negotiators below the age of 25 that are official negotiators with Mexico. And they're trained and they come to the negotiations, and they like, just by being young, they already have a different perspective on the world. So what would the UN look like if all the negotiators were required to be below the age of 45, below the age of 40? Like, what would that look like, right? like we've been talking about presidents being too old forever, but what about the people like deciding the next 100 years? And so there's programs already happening of training youth negotiators, and they're being funded, and they're being trained by a Harvard professor that Mitzi and I, like, we've had talks about how do you actually make sure that our activism gets translated into policy and gets translated into actual, outcomes. And a very clear example is the advisory to the Secretary General, the youth advisory to the Secretary General. So the Secretary General has 7 youth advisors representing each region of the world. And I think his perspective has immensely changed ever since he had youth advisors, because he has become more and more clear on what countries need to do. And I think he's the best Secretary General we could have right now. And businesses, for example, IKEA has a youth advisory board. The World Economic Forum convened 10 youth and 10 businesses over UNGA so that we can tell businesses what we need to see from them. And what we need to see from them is youth advisories on every single level of business as well. Because it's just a no-brainer that if you want to have a future for your business, you also need to have somebody who's thinking about that future. So those are just some of the things that we're doing, and we're really conscious of the fact that we need to institutionalize these processes.
It's also really crucial that we have young people from different sectors of society, and to do that, we need to have that holistic climate education that's empowering from the very local level, so that, you can have all the consultations you want, but if your young people who are the most marginalized, your farmers, your urban poor, your workers, your fisher folk, your indigenous peoples, don't have access even to the language of the text that you're creating and you're consulting on, how are they supposed to be involved in it? And so a lot of it is like breaking down those barriers of knowledge.
Yeah. Just a quick statistic, 87% of youth in the world live in the global south. So 87% of people under 30 live in the global south. What does negotiation look like? Not like 87% of people from the global south. So.
And there's a famous saying in the NGO world that the best people to break the chains are those who wear them, which is the youth. So there's the authority there. Do we have another question? Mandy? Oh, not Mandy. Oh, Mandy. There we go.
Hi, Mandy McReynolds from Workiva. I love that you articulated how finance is being incorporated into the global stock take. I'm curious from the panelists or Paul, how do we see that changing then the approach for business? Because that would also include financial investment and technology advances.
It's almost like, how's business show up in the global stock take?
So I think there is a call for an acceleration and a multiplier effect by use of business finance across all aspects of it. So it's not just mitigation, it's into nature, it's into a just transition, it's into adaptation. And adaptation in particular, for example, is at a pitifully small level compared to where it needs to be. So I think for business, there's also a challenge though, because there's a need for the people who finance, the investors, to also understand the needs of business and for those intersections to happen better than they do at the moment. And I think some of the encouraging things that we're seeing, and maybe picking up also on kind of what will drive change here, is if business starts to now make proper transition plans and sets out what it needs and what it's going to do, then again, and publishes that, then the world can look at that and say, is that going to add up to what we need? And industry by industry, you can then make plans as to what change are you going to drive, what finance is needed, how do we drive finance into the right areas at the right time, and how do we shift the balance of risk at times to be able to be more creative. Again, it's this idea of creativity, to think about why are projects not getting financed at the moment. So how does the system itself need to change so that we accelerate different sorts of blending of finance and different types of risk from different people who are prepared to give it in different ways, so that we actually accelerate finance to where it's needed. So it's kind of not one nor the other. It's working together around a solution that I think is needed here. But it needs to happen fast, right? I think that's, and where we can invest fast. I think the other thing we haven't really talked about here, and it was great that we talked about the optimism and the creativity, is the level of innovation that we have seen and the level of projects and sort of technology that is there if we can drive that change to happen at scale. And that's the great bit about businesses. It can move really, really fast. So if you can put the right finance and business and solution together, then you can actually roll things out at much greater speed than sometimes the political processes take. And that gives me hope.
And things are going well. Companies have been reporting to the NGO that we founded for 20 years now, and President Macron yesterday launched a net zero data public utility of corporate performance, containing entirely actually data from CDP, which we founded 20 years ago, but it was very nice of Mr. Macron to launch it, and President Macron. And I think companies have developed systems to report effectively, and I think governments need to come and match them. So, yeah.
Yeah, just a quick thing on finance. I think when I started in the climate space, I was not thinking about the finances of the world. Striking is free, and we just showed up in the street and demanded change. And then people are here like talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. And I think when you realize how much money there is in the world, you are shocked by the fact that the fossil fuel industry is still receiving subsidies. The fossil fuel industry receives $11 million of subsidies per minute, an equivalent of that. And, for example, Exxon gives 9% of its gross income to renewable energy or transition like development, but it's mostly carbon capture and storage that has been shown to not work at all. If you like emit for a full year, the current carbon capture and storage technology only captures 26 seconds of emissions. Like, it is so insignificant. It's actually like a bit like embarrassing,
Well, what about a challenge to oil and gas companies? If they're serious about carbon capture and storage, I think it would be great if they put on their website homepage the emissions from the product and the emissions reduced with carbon capture and storage, and then everyone would be able to see those two numbers on the homepage of Exxon and Shell.
I mean, it's going to be like this, you know what I mean? Like, that's the thing. So I think like when you realize how much money there is and how much money is not being put into adaptation and mitigation and loss and damage, then all of a sudden we need to change where subsidies are going and make sure that all subsidies to fossil fuels are fully stopped, because that's the place where we are right now. So I think there needs to be those type of decisions being taken. And we're not talking about it enough, but I know the Global Stocktake has the word phase out of fossil fuel emissions in there. So
I think the doctor doesn't pay the patient to buy cigarettes, right? Do we have any other question? Question. No. Sarah.
Hi, thank you. Sarah Goodenough from Climate Policy Radar. You've spoken really coherently about many of the process challenges that have currently been facing the first global stocktake. Unfortunately, we are going to go through this entire process again in 5 years' time. I'd be interested to hear from the panel, what one thing do you think would massively improve, not the outcome, but the process of this global stocktake to help improve climate action in the next 5 years?
Very constructive question. Where should we start? Who wants to go first?
Happy to go first. And thanks, Sarah. And it sounds like maybe that's also one to put back to Climate Policy Radar, which I think has done phenomenal work.
Climate Policy Radar, actually a gigantic database of all the climate policy in the whole world that Sarah and her colleagues have put together. Look it up, Climate Policy Radar, the missing link. You can triangulate between investment and, sorry.
If I were to say one thing though, in response to that question, I think it is the communication around it to a broader audience. And I think within the climate space, we've understood what it's doing. I'd maybe argue we haven't necessarily all fully got behind the importance of it. But I think in terms of a process, what it really needs is to be communicated back to a wider public so that we build a movement of understanding around what these COPs can do and really enable that transparency of data and what's coming through, and really highlight the positive stories that are coming through that data as well, so that it's a balanced picture. So I think that the storytelling component of the global stocktake would be important.
Advice for climate policy for the stocktake?
So interestingly, I literally was going to say communication, but communication in a digestible format that is relevant, accessible, and from a business standpoint, I would think that I make a number up. 80% of business leaders don't really have a clue what the global stocktake is per se. So how do we make this actually realistic? This is where we are. This is where we need to do. And I think the fact that the stocktake actually will come out with an action plan, which itself then businesses, governments can translate into this is what it means for us. That will be the best bit from my perspective, is clear, not just roadmaps, right? We've done a lot of talking about roadmaps, clear, actionable, implementable plans against which we can then map, record transparently, make it real.
One thing that I've learned since coming to UN conferences, I was from COP25, COP26, COP27, COP28, is that you cannot have change happen when you're at a COP. Like, you cannot come to a COP and be like, we want this, because countries spend months drafting their positions, right? So it's like, we need to really be involved in this type of negotiations throughout the process. And it's not all of us who need to be there, but we have to have, as civil society, as businesses, as youth, as strategy, to make sure that when the drafts of the country's positions are being made, we are there. And so I think for the global stocktake, that's the thing, you know, like 5 years time, we need to be working from now, and we need to make sure that, oh my God, we need to make sure that we're not naive and we don't come to each COP and think that we're going to change the world and change the COP when we show up, because it's really a process that requires our full engagement. And that is why everything needs to be done not only through a climate lens, but through an international policy lens and also a local policy lens.
I was going to say something similar to Xie. So the global stocktake, the deadline is every 5 years. You're not supposed to work on it when the deadline's here. That's why we have all of it, right? It's also the same with the NDCs, the plans, all the targets. They're like, oh yeah, we have a target by 2030. How are we getting there? We'll find out in 2029. You know, that's not how you get things done. It's a deadline. So that means you have to be working on it right now. You have to be ensuring, and you know, like businesses do inventories like every day, right? So the global stocktake is an inventory. All of these targets are targets. That means you have to do things today. And I don't know if this is something that we learned in school, and maybe the older generations have forgotten about it, that when you're given a deadline, you don't work on it the night before. Don't procrastinate. Right? They tell you this all the time, like, oh, you shouldn't procrastinate. Why are you procrastinating? You're way past the deadline. Like, you're not even close to the deadline. You don't even have an outline yet, right? So we really need to understand that, right? It's such a bad study group, like all of this.
We all want to get A's on our homework.
Yeah, I think we're almost at the end. We have time for another question? No, we don't. One last question? Yeah. Andrea. No, but people are online, so we actually do need to get you a mic if there is one. Yes, please. Thank you. Just go. Team.
So on the communications point that's been very well made there, coming to this COP, I think more than any other that certainly I've been to, it's felt like people have been sharpening their weapons coming in a lot more. Battle lines have been drawn much earlier, and there's kind of this equal and opposite effect of people, climate communications being ramped up and get gloves coming off, being a lot more edgy. But equally, we're seeing the same kind of heightening of assertion and aggressiveness of response from, I'd say, the other side. How do we thread this needle to communicate more widely, but recognizing the fact that the more assertive we get, we're going to get bigger and bigger pushback? We're seeing some big elections next year, and there have already been some concerning things happening in elections in Europe in particular. How do we communicate this in a way that gets across the urgency without risking the balance of political movements?
I think it might
Bino.
Is on the one hand, there is a lot of awareness out there. We've seen studies that really highlight the fact that the vast majority of people now understand that climate change is a threat and we need to act on it. But then there's a sort of apathy gap, and people understand that, but they're not doing anything. So I heard the other day that 84% of Americans are concerned about climate change, but they're not voting. So I think a first response, and I think the point about elections is so important this year, is how do we make sure that we are translating our awareness into action? And that comes, I think, from more communication and unlocking the sort of hushing space that we've got ourselves into. And I do think second is communicating so much more smartly than we have been doing, the connections between climate change and other impacts like health or like jobs. We've been working with a group called Potential Energy Coalition that's done amazing studies across 23 different regions, scoping out what messages actually resonate with different individuals. And I think we just need so much more of that to understand and equip us with key messages that we can then use and share across citizens so that they really know what's coming at them. And as you were both saying earlier, I think that sort of that understanding of what climate change is connected to that impacts you on the ground is really important. And I think that's happening, which is exciting. We just need to collectively spread it more and be smarter about that messaging.
I think I'm getting a signal that we kind of have to stop now-ish. Yeah, any last, please, Nitsi.
I want to say, as a youth activist, I think pushing the balance is okay. I think it's our role as youth activists specifically, and hopefully maybe more join us, to see that the balance we have now is the status quo. It's not balance, it's imbalance. So we need to change that. So if that means taking the gloves off and like pushing a few people's buttons, then we do that, right? And the crucial and important thing here is, and I hope no one from the fossil fuel industry here is here or from the banking industry, we've done a lot of work where people who do the inside stuff in the negotiations and talking and consulting the banking industry, they'll talk to us on the outside and say, this is where they need more pressure. Yeah. We can't get them there. Help us. Yeah. That's the crucial underground role almost that happens behind the scenes. I hope I'm not exposing anyone. And that's what we need to do. That's how you push balance and find, like that, as Fiona was saying, the being smart about it and communicating. Some people will have that, some people will have this, and understanding the ecosystem of activism and diversity of tactics that we have available to us, and really taking advantage of that, because they do that. They have bilateral meetings that are underground, and right? Like, why aren't we doing it? Let's do that more.
I mean, like, one thing I'll say is, like, the youth movement and the climate movement in general has been stages. And I think 2019, like massive protests all around the world, it was a stage of calling attention. But why did we do that? So we could be in the negotiation spaces and the business spaces, and we could be listened to and heard. So I think we need to evolve as a movement constantly and say we need to scream at world leaders on one day, and the next day we need to be sitting down with them and like, what do we do? And we need to be flexible, and that's the only way that policy will change. Like, if we get a media shock and then an actual policy change, and playing that balance and being able to do that is the thing that we are trying to do as a youth movement.
Is that?
I think we need to embrace the fact that we're sitting also at the edge of huge opportunity for new products, for new services, for new ways of generating energy. And we need to encourage business to not just view this as a threat and a risk, but to view it as a way forward. And those that move first can get that advantage and make change happen, and to do that at scale and bring others with us. So actually embrace and move forward as fast as we can. And I think we're seeing that start. I'm sometimes hugely depressed and pessimistic, but at the moment I'm feeling much more optimistic that actually we can use the levers that we've got to drive us forward and pull the policy and the governments with us, and business can help lead the way.
Outrage and optimism, an excellent note to end on. You said so. But actually, I think for me that if I have the last word, I would say that something extraordinary has happened really in the last couple of years, in the last year particularly. Extreme weather has, everybody got the memo. Billions of people now understand that we have to treat this crisis like a crisis. And Shia, thank you for your reminder to us that we need to evolve as a movement and constantly be far more ambitious than we were before, because we have so much to do and the door is a little bit open, and together we can push it through. Yeah. So thank you very much indeed to our panelists. Thank you to Extreme Hangout.